Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Genesis. Today we're going to look at chapters 16 to 19, and we're actually going to see Abram become Abraham and Sarai become Sarah. And so that's good news to me because now I can stop calling them by the wrong name. And let's get right into that. In chapter 16, we have a kind of ill-advised plot brewing here. They know that the Lord has promised Abram a son, but he's now 99 years old, and his wife Sarah is 90. So they just assume that God isn't going to be able to give them a son the natural way, so they figure that they would help God along. And whenever we try to help God along in our lives, bad things typically are going to happen, and there's no exception here with Abraham. So they create this plan for Abram to lie with her servant Hagar, and they'd have a child that way. Now that might seem kind of crazy to us. It seems like, why would you do that? But back in those days, that wasn't that far off from the cultural custom. And in fact, sometimes in a marriage covenant, it would be basically written in there that if the woman could not conceive a child and bear a child, then they were to have a child there. Then the male was to have a child other ways, because one of the main purposes of family was to continue the family line. So this was kind of an acceptable thing to do culturally wise, but that wasn't what God wanted them to do. And whenever we follow the ways of the world over the ways of God, bad things are going to come with that. So their scheme was successful, and Hagar was pregnant, but now, shockingly, Sarai is not happy about it. It's surprising that encouraging your husband to sleep with another woman didn't make for a happy marriage, but here they are. So now Sarai was upset with Hagar as if it was her fault, and Hagar actually runs away because she's afraid for her life, because Sarai is no longer treating her very well. And she's afraid for her life and the life of her child. And while she's on the run, in verses 7 to 11, we see that the angel of the Lord actually spoke to her and told her to return to Abram. But it was more than that. Notice what happens here. Hagar was all alone, and the people closest to her had all turned on her. But God was there. He told Hagar to name her child Ishmael, which means God hears. And remember, Psalms 34:18 tells us that God is near to the brokenhearted, and he hears their cries. And so God knew Hagar was alone. He knew that she was hurting, and he was there for her. And so then look at the promise that God lays out for Ishmael. And it's kind of a mixed bag here. He says that he'll be a wild man, and their hand would be against everyone. So the Ishmaelites would go on to be a constant thorn in the side of the Jews, and it can all be traced back to the disobedience of Abram and Sarai. Now, speaking of them, we come to their story again in chapter 17. God appears to Abram and tells him that he would have a son, and that son would come from Sarai. It is through him that God would fulfill his covenant. Then in verses 4 to 8, he becomes Abraham. Now, names were very important back in these days, and the name Abram meant great father, while the name Abraham meant father of a multitude. And remember, God has promised Abraham now that his descendants would outnumber the stars, they would be greater than the sands on the seashore. So God renews his covenant, and it is here that God makes circumcision a sign of the covenant between him and his people. Now, if you're wondering why this would be a sign, here's a possible answer from Dr. Tony Evans. He says, removing the male foreskin helped to prevent disease, and God used the practice to prefigure how his kingdom would operate. It would be purged of impurity and would pursue holiness. So that's the sign of God's new covenant with Abraham. So then we turn our attention to his wife. God changes her name to Sarah, which actually means princess. So with new names, God tells them that the two of them are going to have a child, and Abraham laughs at God. Because of that, their son was to be named Isaac, meaning he laughs. So after that, Abraham immediately obeys the Lord's command, and he and all his men are circumcised, just as God has commanded. And then we come to chapter 18, and this is the famous story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham's nephew Lot also plays a central part in this. So make sure that you read this whole story, read this whole account, because it shows us a lot about the Lord and how he tolerates evil. But it's actually an interesting scene here at the beginning of chapter 18, because Abraham is visited by what appear to be three men, and he doesn't know who these three men are. He thinks they're just like three random guys coming up, but it turns out that these three men are the Lord himself and two angels, as we see here in this chapter. And the Lord himself, when it says that, what this is what's called a Christophany. So what it means is Christ himself is appearing before he has been like born in human form. So it's a pre-incarnate Christ has come down here to speak with Abraham. So this is a pretty powerful scene. So Abraham doesn't actually know who they really were, but nevertheless, he still showed them hospitality, which is a good lesson. What we see here is God sitting with Abraham for half a day, fellowshipping with him and surrounding his promise with his presence. It's actually here that God again specifically says that Abraham would have a son with his wife Sarah. And Sarah overhears them and laughs because she's an old woman. So now Abraham has laughed at God, and now Sarah has also laughed. And God hears her and he responds and he says, "Is anything impossible for God?" And Sarah tries to deny that she laughed, but God's like, "Dude, I'm God. I heard you. I know what you did. I know you laughed." And it's like, "Hello, Sarah. Do you remember who you're dealing with? I am God. Is anything impossible for me?" God is omnipotent and nothing is impossible for him. So it was true then, and it is just as true now. And after God has spent time with Abraham, he tells him that the other reason he's here is to judge the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. He says that the way they were treated when they arrived would determine if they were as wicked as he's heard. And he said there in Genesis that like the earth has cried out with the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he's coming to really put a test and see for himself firsthand, is this really as evil as it seems? So God comes with his two angels, and the two men, which were angels, we know, they went to go down there, but the Lord stayed with Abraham a little longer. And Abraham evidently knows the deal. He knows what's going on down there because he starts negotiating with God. He says, "God, if there are 50 righteous people, okay, would you spare the land?" And God says, "Yeah, sure, for 50 I will." And then he works it down. 45, yeah. 30, yeah. What about 20? What about 10? God says, "You know what? You can find 10 righteous men down there. I will spare the city." And the deal being, if you find just 10, I will not destroy the city and all of their evil because of that righteousness. But this was a safe bet for God to make because he knows outside of maybe Lot, there's not a single righteous person down there. And so after that, we see in chapter 19, everything turns to the angel's journey to the land of Sodom, which is where Lot is. So let's look at this exchange. Let's see what happens here in chapter 19. These men, and remember, they're actually angels, but they are men. They appear as just being men to Lot and the people of Sodom, obviously, and they've come into the city, and they're just going to sleep on the streets and see what happens. And that would not have turned out well. And Lot knows that, and Lot's like, "Look, you don't want to do that. Come with me." And he basically convinces them. He talks them in to coming and staying with him. But when the people come in, the men of the city, they hear about it, and it says both young and old. So when it says both young and old came, what they're probably meaning is that maybe not every man in the city, not all men are like that. We've heard that before. Not every man in the city goes, but most of them, okay? Probably a vast majority. And they came and wanted to essentially like rape these visitors. And that's a sick thing that they want to do. They want to rape and probably eventually like kill these men. But look at Lot's response. He offers to give them his daughters and have them instead. And so, like, come on, like, what kind of an offer is that? But it actually might have been that he was like using hyperbole, like saying, "Come on, like these are my visitors under my roof. I'm responsible for them. It would be just like me handing you my daughters." But I don't really know that it meant that. I would assume probably that he just meant this literally, and he's saying like, "Here, take my daughters instead." And the men just have no interest. They don't want that. They want these men that they don't know. So it also, again, shows a lack of faith in God to take care of him. Instead of Lot trusting God that God would take care of things, he would take care of the angels, he would take care of his family, he tries to come up with his own human reasoning and comes up with a pretty dumb idea, if I do say so myself. So the angels these guys are trying to break down the door to get in there, and they're going to take the men. If Lot doesn't give them up, they're going to take them by force. And the angels actually strike down all the men with blindness so they can't even find the door, let alone break it down. So now it's clear how wicked this place is. And the angels reveal who they are and God's plan to Lot. And they tell him that he needs to take his family and get out of the city. Lot tells his sons-in-law that they need to come and they need to leave this city, and they don't heed God's warning. They don't listen to Lot. They think he's just joking, but they will soon regret that decision. They refused to leave, and even Lot hesitated before the angels essentially drag him out. They had to drag out Lot, his wife, and his daughters so that they could destroy the city. And once they are out, they're warned not to look back, and Lot's wife just can't help herself, and so she was turned into a pillar of salt. Now, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction, well, it clearly shows God's judgment against homosexuality, because that's what these men were like. That's what these men wanted to do. The men wanted to come rape other men, and so that's God's judgment against homosexuality. That was a big part of their wickedness, but that wasn't everything. In Luke 17:32, Jesus charged us to remember not the evil men of Sodom, but Lot's wife, because our temptation is to become too attached to this world. Jesus teaches us to be in the world, but not of it, because if we are of the world, we'll be contaminated by its wicked ways, just like Lot's family was. And so then we wrap this chapter up with another pretty sick story. Lot has lived quite a life. Lot's daughters, okay, his wife's gone, their husbands are gone, and it's just Lot and his two daughters. And they get together and they're like, hey, Dad doesn't have a male heir. What are we going to do about that? Dad needs an heir so that he could keep the family line going. And so they come up with this scheme, which was pretty sick, to get their father drunk, and they would each take a turn to sleep with him and become pregnant so that he could have an heir. They were successful in this plan, and they both were pregnant, and they both gave birth to children, and those children would grow up to become the Moabites and the Ammonites, which are going to be constant enemies of God's people. So here, Lot's daughters, not that unlike what Sarah has done, trying to solve problems with their human reasoning, and ended up creating much greater problems. You've got the Ishmaelites that are now there, and that would be constantly fighting and at war with God's people. And you've also got the Moabites and the Ammonites that, if it hadn't have been for sinful ways and a lack of trust in God, none of those things would have happened. But that's all from this eventful set of stories here in the book of Genesis. I'll see you back here tomorrow in the book of Joshua.